Good old Bilbo, Bilbo, Bilbo. And then he fell asleep, and there was complete silence for a long while. All of a sudden, Dwalin opened an eye and looked round about. "Where's Thorin?" he asked. It was a terrible shock. Of course, there was only 13 of them, 12 dwarfs and a hobbit. Where indeed was Thorin? They wondered what evil fate had befallen him, magic or dark monsters, and shuddered as they lay lost in the forest. There they dropped off one by one into uncomfortable sleep, full of horrible dreams as evening wore to black night. And there we must leave them for the present too, sick and weary to set guards or to take turns at watching. Thorin had been caught much faster than they had. Do you remember Bilbo falling like a log into sleep when he stepped into the circle of light with the elves? The next time it had been Thorin who stepped forward, and as the lights went out, he fell like a stone enchanted, all the noise of the dwarves lost in the night. Their cries as the spiders caught them and bound them, and all the sounds of battle the next day, they had passed over him unheard. Then the wood elves came to him, bound him, and carried him away. The feasting people were, of course, wood elves. They are not wicked folk. If they have a fault, it is distrust of strangers. Though their magic is strong, even in those days, they were weary. They differed from the high elves of the west, and were more dangerous and less wise. For most of them, together with their scattered relations in the hills and mountains, were descended from the ancient tribes that never went to faerie in the west. There the light elves and deep elves and sea elves went and lived for ages, and grew fairer and wiser and more learned, and invented their magic and their cunning craft in the making of beautiful and marvellous things, before some came back to the wide world. In the wide world the wood elves lingered in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved best the stars, and they wandered in the great forests, grew tall in the lands that are now lost. They dwelt most often by the edges of woods, from which they could escape at times to hunt or to ride and run over the open lands by moonlight or starlight. And after the coming of men, they took more and more to the gloaming of the dusk. Still elves they were, and remain, and that is good people. In a great cave, some miles within the edge of Mirkwood on the eastern side, there lived at this time their greatest king. Before his huge doors of stone a river ran at the heights of the forest and flowed on and out into the marshes at the feet of the high wooded lands. This great cave, from which countless smaller ones opened on every side, wound far underground, and had many passages and wide halls, but it was lighter and more wholesome than any goblin dwelling, and neither so deep nor so dangerous. In fact, the subjects of the king mostly lived and hunted in the open woods, and had houses or huts on the ground or in the branches. The beeches were their favourite trees. The king's cave was his palace, and the strong place of his treasure, and the fortress of his people against their enemies. But it was also the dungeon of his prisoners. So to the cave they dragged Thorin, not too gently, for they did not love dwarves, and thought he was an enemy. In ancient days they had had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accursed of stealing and their treasures. It is only fair to say that the dwarves gave a different account, and said that they only took what was their due, for the elf king had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver, and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. If the elf king had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems, and, though his hoard was rich, he was ever eager for more, since he had not yet as great a treasure as other elf lords of old. His people neither mined nor worked metals or jewels, nor did they bother much with trade or with the tilling of earth. All this was well known to every dwarf, though Thorin's family had had nothing to do with the old quarrel I have spoken of. Consequently, Thorin was angry at their treatment of him, and they soon took their spell off him, and he came to his senses. And also he was determined that no word of gold or jewels should be dragged out of him. The king looked sternly at Thorin when he was brought before him, and asked him many questions, but Thorin would only say he was starving. "Why did you and your folk 3 times try to attack my people at their merrymaking?" asked the king. "We did not attack them," answered Thorin. "We came to beg because we were starving." "Where are your friends now, and what are they doing?" "I don't know, but I expect starving in the forest." "What were you doing in my forest?" "Looking for food and drink because we were starving." But what brought you into my forest at all?" asked the king angrily. At that Thorin shut his mouth and would say no other word. "Very well," said the king. "Take him away and keep him safe. until he feels inclined to tell the truth, even if he waits 100 years. Then the elves put thongs on him and shut him in one of the inmost caves of the wooden strong doors and left him. They gave him food and drink, plenty of both, but not very fine, for wood elves were not goblins, but were reasonably well behaved even to their worst enemies when they captured them. The giant spiders were the only living things that they had no mercy upon. There, in the king's dungeon, poor Thorin lay, and after he had gotten over his thankfulness for bread and meat and water, he began to wonder what had become of his unfortunate friends. It was not very long before he discovered, but that belongs to the next chapter, and the beginning of another adventure in which the Hobbit again showed his usefulness. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9. Barrels Out of Bond. The day after the battle with the spiders, Bilbo and the dwarves made one last despairing effort to find a way out before they died of hunger and thirst. They got off and staggered in the direction which 8 of the 13 of them guessed to be the one in which the path lay, but they never found out if they were right. Such day as there was ever in the forest was fading once more into blackness of night, when suddenly outsprang the light of many torches all around them, like hundreds of red stars. Out leaped the wood elves with their bows and spears and called the dwarves to halt. There was no thought of a fight. Even if the dwarves had been in such a state that they were actually glad to be captured, their small knives, the only weapons they had, would have been no use against the arrows of the elves that could hit a bird's eye in the dark. So they simply stopped dead and sat down and waited, all except Bilbo, who popped on his ring and slipped quickly to one side. That is why, when the elves bound the dwarves in a long line, one behind the other, and counted them, they never found or counted the hobbit, nor did they hear or feel him trotting along well behind their torchlight as they led the prisoners off into the forest. Each dwarf was blindfolded, but that did not make much of a difference, for even Bilbo, with the use of his eyes, could not see where they were going, and neither he nor the others knew where they had started from anyway. Bilbo had all he could do to keep up the torches, for the elves were making the dwarfs go so fast as ever they could, sick and weary as they were. The king had ordered them to make haste. Suddenly the torches stopped, and the hobbit had just time to catch them before they began to cross the bridge. This was the bridge that led across the river to the king's doors. The water flowed dark and swift and strong beneath, and at the far end were gates before the mouth of a huge cave that ran into the side of a steep slope covered with trees. There the great beeches came right down to the bank till their feet were in the stream. Across the bridge the elves thrust their prisoners, but Bilbo hesitated in the rear. He did not at all like the look of the cavern mouth, but he only made up his mind not to desert his friends just in time to scuttle over the heels of the last elves before the great gates of the king closed behind them with a clang. Inside the passages were lit with red torch light, and the elf guards sang as they marched along the twisting, crossing, and echoing paths. These were not like those of the goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep underground, and filled with cleaner air. In a great hall with pillars hewn out of the living stone sat the elven king on a chair of carven wood. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for the autumn was come again. In the spring he wore a crown of woodland flowers. In his hand he held a carven staff of oak. The prisoners were brought before him, and though he looked grim at them, he told his men to unbind them, for they were ragged and weary. "Besides, they need no ropes in here," said he. "There is no escape from my magic doors for those who are brought inside." Long and searchingly he questioned the dwarves about their doings, where they were going to, where they were coming from, but he got little more news out of them than they did out of Thorin. They were surely angry, and did not even pretend to be polite. "What have we done, O king?" said Balin, who was the eldest left. "It is a crime to be lost in the forest, to be hungry and thirsty, is it? To be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pets, if killing them makes you so angry?" Such a question, of course, made the king angrier than ever, and he answered, "It is a crime to wander in my realm without leave. Do you forget that you were in my kingdom, using the road that my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue and trouble my people in the forest, and rouse spiders with your riot and clamour? After all the disturbance you have made, I have a right to know what brings you here, and if you will not tell me now, I will keep you all prisoner until you have learned sense and manners." Then he ordered the dwarfs each to be put in a separate cell and to be given food and drink, but not to be allowed to pass the doors of their little prisons until one at least of them was willing to tell all he wanted to know. But he did not tell them that Thorin was also a prisoner with them. It was Bilbo who found that out. Poor Mr. Baggins. It was a weary long time that he was living alone in that place, and always never daring to take off his ring, hardly daring to sleep, even tucked away in the darkest and remotest corners he could find of the realm. For something to do, he took to wandering about the Elven King's palace. He shut the gates, but he could sometimes get out if he was quick. Companies of wood elves, sometimes with the king at their head, would from time to time ride out to hunt, or to some other business in the woods in the lands to the east. Then, if Bilbo was quick and nimble, he could slip just out behind them, though it was a dangerous thing to do. More than once he was almost caught in the doors as they clashed together when the last elf passed. Yet he did not dare to march among them because of his shadow, altogether thin and wobbly as it was in torchlight, or for fear of being bumped into and discovered. And when he did go out, which was not very often, he did no good anyway. He did not wish to desert the dwarfs, and indeed he did not know where to go in the world to go without them. He could not keep up with the hunting elves all the time when they were out, so he never discovered the ways out of the wood at all, and was left to wander miserably in the forest, terrified of losing himself, until a chance came of returning. He was hungry too outside, for he was no hunter, but inside the caves he could pick up a living of some sort by stealing food from stores or tables when no one was at hand. "I am like that burglar that can't get away, but must go on miserably burgling the same house day after day," he thought. "This is the dreariest and dullest part of all this wretched, tiresome, uncomfortable adventure. I wish I was back in my hobbit hole by my own warm fireside with the lamp shining." He often wished, too, that he could get a message for help to the wizard, but that, of course, was quite impossible, and he soon himself realized that if anything was to be done, it would have to be done by Mr. Baggins, alone and unaided. Eventually, after a week or two of this sneaking sort of life, by watching and following the guards and taking what chances he could, he managed to find out where each dwarf was kept. He found all their 12 cells in different parts of the palace, and after a time he got to know his way around very well. What was his surprise one day to overhear some of the guards talking and to learn that there was another place where a dwarf was imprisoned too, in a specially deep, dark place. He guessed at once, of course, that it was Thorin, and after a while he found that his guess was right. At last, after many difficulties, he managed to find the place when no one was about, and to have a word with the chief of the dwarfs. Thorin was too wretched to be angry any longer at his misfortune, and was even beginning to think of telling the king all about his treasure and his quest, which shows how low-spirited he had become, when he heard Bilbo's little voice at his keyhole. He could hardly believe his ears. Soon, however, he made up his mind that he could not be mistaken, and he came to the door and had a long whispered talk with the hobbit on the other side. So it was that Bilbo was able to take secretly Thorin's messages to each of the other imprisoned dwarfs, telling them that Thorin, their chief, was also a prisoner close at hand, and that no one was to reveal their errand to the king, not yet, not before Thorin gave the word. For Thorin had taken heart again, hearing how the hobbit had rescued his companions from the spiders, and was determined once more not to ransom himself with promises to the king of a share in the treasure, until all hope of escaping in any other way had disappeared, until, in fact, the remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins, of whom he began to have a very high opinion, had altogether failed to think of something clever to get them out. The other dwarves quite agreed when they got the message. They all thought that their own shares in the treasure, which they quite regarded as theirs in spite of the plight and still unconquered dragon, would suffer seriously if the Wood Elves claimed part of it, and they all trusted Bilbo. Just what Gandalf had said would happen, you see. Perhaps that was part of his reason for going off and leaving them. Bilbo, however, did not feel nearly so hopeful as they did. He did not like being depended on by anyone, and he wished he had the wizard at hand. But that was no use. Probably all the dark distance of Mirkwood lay between them. He sat and thought until he had nearly burst. but no bright idea would come. One invisible ring was a very fine thing, but it was not much good among 14. But, of course, as you have guessed, he did rescue